Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's Alliance for Aging Research webinar, CMS's coverage decision. It's not just about Alzheimer's disease. My name is Sue Peshin, and I serve as President and CEO of the Alliance for Aging Research, the leading nonprofit organization dedicated to advancing research to improve aging and health. The Alliance convenes the Alzheimer's Disease Policy Task Force, an ad hoc coalition representing people living with Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, family caregivers, as well as the leading expert organizations and coalitions in the space. You will hear from some of them today. To learn more about the task force, please go to agingresearch.org/AD Policy Task Force. For background, because we're fortunate to have a wide audience today, I want to start with an overview of the proposed Medicare coverage guidelines. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS for short, is the federal agency that oversees the Medicare and Medicaid programs. CMS has a big decision in front of them regarding Medicare coverage for all FDA-approved monoclonal antibody therapies targeting amyloid for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. We'll refer to these drugs as MABs during some of the discussions. Some of you may have heard this coverage decision is only about Biogen's drug, Aduhelm, but that is not true. CMS has initiated its coverage decision for the MAB drug class, which encompasses several drugs in clinical development that could be available very soon. CMS has proposed to provide coverage for these new Alzheimer's disease drugs under a tool called Coverage with Evidence Development, or CED for short. Under CED, Medicare covers an item or service under the condition that it's provided to patients within a clinical trial or if the patient participates in a mandatory data registry. The CMS approved studies and registries are typically much smaller than the number of beneficiaries that would be able to benefit from the treatment if it were more widely accessible. For context, this means that affected treatments are available to a few thousand beneficiaries rather than broadly to the affected population. And under CED, there is no coverage available for the item or service Medicare beneficiaries that are not in these studies or registries. There are only 21 of these active national coverage decisions that require CED, and CMS tends to use them for more expensive devices and procedures that would be used by a larger number of beneficiaries than with other types of treatments, though the agency claims that cost isn't a consideration. In the Alliance's experience and view, this coverage tool is all about saving costs, full stop. National coverage decisions requiring CED also run counter to CMS's stated goal to try to improve equity and access. We know this from our experience working on CEDs for less invasive heart valve disease treatments. One such treatment, known as TAVR, which CMS often points to as a successful use of CED, has instead created unnecessary hurdles for smaller and rural hospitals, eliminating access to the less invasive alternative to open heart surgery for the patients that they serve. In effect, it's exacerbated access issues and disparities for minority and rural populations, and CMS knows this. The CMS approved registry reports 3 to 4% people of color being able to access the new heart valve treatments compared to 96 to 97% of whites, depending on the year. And this has been going on for 10 years. These outcomes and limitations on real-world data collection are due in no small part to the restrictions in access put in place by CMS. And in fact, when the agency reconsidered this determination in 2018, they cited the lack of minority data as a reason for continuing it. So the equity factor was used to justify the continued restricted access. We do not want that to happen here with Alzheimer's disease treatments or for treatments for any other life-threatening diseases. It's important to note that CMS has never used CED for Medicare drug coverage. Why is that? Because CMS covers drugs for FDA-approved, medically accepted uses. This would be the first time, but we believe it will not be the last. In fact, if CMS finalizes the proposed coverage determination, it's going to set dangerous precedents for rationing Medicare beneficiary access in two really important ways. First, it's going to impact access to current and future FDA-approved Alzheimer's drugs, and the agency is going to be able to use this decision to restrict access to future FDA-approved drugs for other serious and life-threatening conditions that are reviewed under the congressionally authorized accelerated approval pathway. Now, the use of accelerated approval has been an important regulatory mechanism for the FDA to allow for earlier approval of drugs that treat serious and life-threatening illnesses that then would occur through the traditional approval program. Created in 1992, the accelerated approval pathway was conceived as a direct response to patient therapy during the HIV/AIDS epidemic and in recognition of the urgency of access to new therapy needs faced by patients that had life-threatening illnesses. So as opposed to traditional approval, which is based upon a direct measure of clinical benefit or a validated surrogate, accelerated approval is intended to allow for the initial approval of a drug based on demonstration of effect on a surrogate endpoint or an intermediate clinical endpoint that is reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit. This regulatory pathway is used frequently in oncology and has been used for other life-threatening conditions, such as multiple sclerosis and rare diseases, where patients and physicians have run out of or lack entirely options to treat a fatal illness. Under FDA regulations, sponsors conduct post-marketing studies that verify and describe the expected clinical benefit of the drug with the clinical trial design as agreed upon with the FDA at the time of accelerated approval. That's why CMS requirements for further study would be repetitive and would directly compete with post-market requirements by the FDA, drag out evidence collection, and further restrict access. With that said, the Alliance and our task force partners will be submitting a public comment tomorrow in support of coverage for FDA-approved uses of monoclonal antibody therapies targeting amyloid for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease for Medicare beneficiaries nationwide. It's the people with Alzheimer's disease, informed by their healthcare providers, that should have the choice of whether to use FDA-approved drugs, and CMS should not take that away. So the first of today's three-panel program is going to take a closer look at the feasibility of the equity requirements in the draft coverage decision. Our second panel includes research experts and early-stage investors in cures for neurological disease. And on our third panel, we're going to hear from former senior HHS and CMS staff on the concerns that the decision represents a challenge to the FDA's approval authority from CMS. So let's get started. Now, our first panel for today is the health equity and access impacts of CMS's decision, and we're fortunate to have with us Gretchen Wortman, Vice President for Policy and Program with the National Minority Equality Forum, Stephanie Monroe, Executive Director of African Americans Against Alzheimer's, and Jim Taylor, family caregiver to his wife, Jerry Taylor, who lives with Alzheimer's disease and helped found Voices of Alzheimer's. Welcome, and thank you all for being here. Gretchen, Stephanie, and Jim, please tell us more about yourselves and why you think this CMS decision is problematic.
Thank you, Sue, and good afternoon. My name is Gretchen Wortman. I'm Vice President for Policy and Program of the National Minority Equality Forum and Director of our Institute for Equity in Health Policy and Practice. Excuse me. For those who don't know us, the National Minority Equality Forum is a 501c3 not-for-profit research and advocacy organization based in Washington, D.C. The mission of the forum is to reduce patient risk by assuring optimal care for all. The forum's vision is an American health services research delivery and financing system whose operating principle is to reduce patient risk for amenable morbidity and mortality while improving quality of life. Our priorities include research designs that prevent algorithmic and methodological biases and assure the statistically significant inclusion of all population cohorts, a system of care that provides clinicians with maximum flexibility in responding to patient needs and preferences, including diagnosis and treatment guidelines, prescription drug formularies, performance measures, and payment models. Increased transparency and empowerment of patients, beneficiaries, and healthcare consumers is the final value through enhanced monitoring and evaluation of the outcomes associated with promulgated policy and regulation and widespread dissemination of findings. So in short, the CMS proposed NCED is problematic because it is fundamentally inconsistent with the values and principles that undergird all NMQF activity. We exist because of this type of systemic structured inequity. It is insupportable.
Stephanie, thank you, Gretchen.
Sure. Us Against Alzheimer's. I'm Stephanie Monroe. I'm Executive Director of African Americans Against Alzheimer's, which is a network of Us Against Alzheimer's, an innovative patient advocacy organization in Washington, D.C. It's been around since 2010. We've been working to ensure adequate research and attention to Alzheimer's disease, especially in communities, especially among African Americans, Latinos, and women. We seek to normalize brain health, prevention, diagnosis, treatment, care, and other strategies that will help find a cure for this terrible disease as soon as we can. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this panel.
Thanks, Stephanie. Jim, Jerry, hi. You guys are on mute. Hi, guys, you're on mute. Can you hit the unmute? There you go.
I'm Jerry Taylor, and I'm living with Alzheimer's.
Hi, I'm Jim Taylor, and my most important and rewarding job is being Jerry's husband and care partner. She was diagnosed nearly 10 years ago, and since that time, we have spoken widely about living with Alzheimer's. In order to address the stigma associated with the disease, to encourage individuals to live joyfully and purposefully after their diagnosis, and to strongly promote participation in Alzheimer's clinical trials. I am the FDA appointed patient advocate for Alzheimer's disease. Jerry and I have co-founded MAP, Memory Advocate Peers, a volunteer organization which trains former dementia care partners to support newly diagnosed individuals and their care partners. Recently, I established a small group of outstanding individuals living with AD called the Voices of Alzheimer's, a platform to raise our voices and educate the public about the varied experiences of those living with AD. 8 months ago, in a courageous decision, the FDA approved the first disease-modifying therapy for Alzheimer's disease. That decision lighted a bright candle of hope for 6 million Americans living with this disease and their 18 million care partners. Alone among the top 10 deadly diseases, AD is the only disease which has no medication to prevent, slow, or cure the disease. Now, another government agency in an unprecedented action would essentially take that drug away from us, extinguishing the flame that has finally lighted a path to a higher quality of life and more years to share with one's grandchildren. This is an unconscionable decision we must not let stand. Thank you, Sue.
Thanks, Jim. Thank you. Okay, I have a couple of questions to get us started here. And my first question is for Gretchen. Stifling access to monoclonal antibodies for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease is going to have wide-ranging impact on patients around the country. But CMS is using diversity in clinical trials, which is an aim that I know for sure you all and many of us are working to advance together as kind of a cudgel to limit access for everybody. Unfortunately, Black and Hispanic populations also experience higher rates of Alzheimer's, thereby having an even more concerning impact on minority patients and other vulnerable populations. So Gretchen, can you help us understand why that is and what the decision could mean for underserved patients with Alzheimer's and other neurodegenerative conditions?
I'll try. Okay. And I would say the short answer, Sue, is that this decision will reinforce, excuse me, financial and physical barriers to accessing treatment that will increase the patient's risk for amenable morbidity and earlier mortality, and impede the creation of new knowledge that will accrue to the benefit of all patients with and at risk for Alzheimer's disease. The longer answer is that the National Minority Quality Forum has created the Institute for Equity in Health Policy and Practice in response to the forward-looking consensus that equity must become integral to the American Health Services research delivery and financing construct. Yeah. The Institute is structured as a partnership that will enable key stakeholders in the public and private sectors to design a policy and regulatory infrastructure that is imbued with the principles of equity and reduction of patient risk. The CMS proposed NCED, which is the subject of our conversation this morning, is almost a textbook example of structural policies and practices that create, perpetuate, or exacerbate inequities that become highly visible and measurable in populations with negative social determinants of health. Population projections published in the by the US Census Bureau in February of 2020 project increases during the next 40 years of seniors and racial and ethnic population cohorts, the same populations who have experienced greater harms during the COVID-19 pandemic and will experience the harms created by the CMS National Coverage Determination with evidence development. I've probably exhausted the time available to me already, so I'll close with the following. CMS staff in a number of forums have made the statement that they need public comment because they want to, quote, get it right. Well, in our view, through every possible lens, they are getting it wrong. I can summarize our concerns by stating that in an intolerably cynical and disingenuous manner, they are weaponizing the result of a history of bias and betrayal of particular population cohorts to justify bias toward and betrayal of a particular patient cohort. So regardless of your position on amyloid beta plaques, on monoclonal antibodies, or on PET scans, I encourage everyone listening to this panel to view the CMS action through the lens of a new troubling precedent that can be used by CMS and those in the commercial sector who follow their lead to justify rationing of care in all therapeutic areas and for all populations. I encourage you all to review the excellent and comprehensive comment letter that Sue and her team have crafted and to either sign on or send a separate letter that articulates your specific concerns. We plan to do both. And so thank you again, Sue, for the opportunity to participate this afternoon.
Oh, Gretchen, thank you so much. That was really powerful. Okay, so Stephanie, I have a question for you as well. Much of your work has focused on the broader issue of brain health inequity. And it would be really, I think, interesting for folks to hear an insider's view of the current state of that battle and how the CMS's actions are going to impede the progress that your group and the groups that you're working with have made so far.
Well, that's a great question. And thank you so much, Sue. Let me first say that at Us Against Alzheimer's, we agree completely with CMS's goal of requiring the diversity of patients, in fact, in all trials, not just this one, and that it should be representative of the national population diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. We know that African-American people are at least twice as likely, and Latinos are at least 1.5 times as likely to develop Alzheimer's when compared to non-Hispanic white Americans. Yet, despite this higher risk, they are less likely to actually receive an accurate, timely diagnosis to enable them to take advantage of treatments that may be available to address some of the symptoms of Alzheimer's. This, of course, includes the ability to have access to strategies to both prevent onset of Alzheimer's disease, according to the National Alzheimer's Plan and the recently added prevention goal, and also to sort of normalize, routinize Alzheimer's and brain health with subjective measures to at least begin to have the conversation. So, you know, it's one of those situations where we don't know what we don't know. We know that these populations are very overrepresented in terms of the disease and high prevalence, very underrepresented in terms of clinical research. But there's three things that we think are problematic with the CED related to the equity issues. First of all, it doesn't define representation. Second, it limits the access to randomized control trials that are conducted in larger academic center locations. And thirdly, it excludes people with comorbidities. So first, you know, CED talks about wanting to make sure that people, you know, it mirrors people who are diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. That's great, except we know that about 40% of the people who actually have Alzheimer's are missed in terms of the diagnosis. So we need to be aggressively making sure that people get the diagnosis that they need, that they're actually informed about it, and that they're empowered to get access to these medications. That doesn't happen through the CED. In fact, the absolute opposite is happening there. To ensure equitable access to FDA-approved treatment, CMS must provide clarity in how it will define representation, what data sources will be acceptable, considering the many gaps that exist in current surveillance data for people at risk and or living with Alzheimer's and dementia. This is true for subpopulations that have been traditionally understudied in the Alzheimer's field. Secondly, the CED relies almost exclusively on randomized control trials in large academic centers. Historically, just 1.2% of clinical trials participants for new Alzheimer's drugs are African American, about 5.6% Hispanic, and about 4% Asian. The eligibility criteria that's used to determine who qualifies for enrollment in a traditional randomly controlled trial excludes people of color who are at greater risk of Alzheimer's disease and other dementia. In addition, a recent analysis found that 60% of Alzheimer's trials funded by NIA have at least one research exclusion criteria that could disproportionately affect African American and Latino participants compared to non-Hispanic whites. That's a serious situation where, you know, and we're also looking at the fact that large academic centers aren't necessarily the most trusted in America when it comes time for people who are African American, Latino, people who are dual language speakers to be able to have access. They're going a lot of times to smaller sites, not large academic centers, where they don't feel that they have trust. They don't feel like they're being understood, and they don't feel that they're being represented by people who look like them, who really understand their situation. So forcing people to go into those settings for which there's not been trust, there's not been workplace initiatives that, you know, have diversified the workforce, et cetera, is going to necessitate an exclusion, unfortunately, of people from accessing the trial that they would need in order to get this particular treatment or class of treatments. And then finally, excluding people with chronic conditions. We urge CMS to address the impact on people of color who are managing chronic conditions. We know that scientists typically are very pure specimens and individuals who don't have chronic conditions. We also know that approximately 40% of people with Alzheimer's also have comorbidities, including high blood pressure, heart disease, diabetes. So by randomly controlling out these conditions, you are automatically eliminating and creating a bias against people who have chronic conditions, and these happen to be the persons most excluded from clinical research and most in need of this trial. So we really urge CMS to further explore the parameters of exclusion criteria. Finally, we really think that, you know, CMS needs to revise its CED to further address these critical health equity points, and look forward to working with them to make that happen.
Thank you, Stephanie. That was great. I think, you know, it also sort of speaks to CMS has stated that they want a representative population of their beneficiaries, and what both you and Gretchen just spoke about, it's not happening in the CED.
Absolutely.
So Jim, the journey that Jerry and you have gone on has been, both certainly inspirational. The way that you are both using your time, and how Jerry refused to give up when diagnosed, and heartbreaking in that a drug that for Jerry seemed to have a clinical benefit is unlikely to be available except for a few thousand beneficiaries. You've touched on it a bit already, but given some of the discussions about Aduhelm's efficacy, I think that our attendees would be interested to hear more about how the treatment made a difference for Jerry, and about the broader effects of this decision on your family and other family caregivers. Can you share more about that?
Sue, first of all, thank you very much for providing an opportunity for those with the disease and care partners to have a voice in this egregious decision of CMS. Jerry speaks very little in public forums now, and that's a tremendous loss because she is eloquent about living with Alzheimer's and about her declining cognition. However, she has had the good fortune to participate in the aducanumab, now Aduhelm clinical trial for over 7 years. And we have no doubt that the medication has slowed her cognitive decline and given her more years as a prominent national advocate for people with the disease. I estimate that before COVID, we had spoken to about 15,000 people. In the early years of her disease, we maintained a very aggressive schedule, traveling widely across the US and twice to Europe to speak. Jerry's decline was extremely slow, but in 2019, the Aduhelm clinical trial was temporarily halted for 12 months. During that time, Jerry's cognition and ability to communicate noticeably declined. She has suffered no adverse side effects from the medication. We understand that this drug is not effective for everyone, but Jerry's experience has been very positive. Unfortunately, ours is a despondent community. With no medication that will alter the course of the disease, there is very limited opportunity to manage Alzheimer's or to make positive choices. Now the hope that one government agency has given us just 8 months ago, another government agency dares to take away. Our community is trying to find its voice, to cry out in disbelief, in dismay, in anger, and in protest. Given the stigma that we must endure every day, how dare you put us on this emotional roller coaster? Our country has dark chapters in its medical history. A major reason, as we've heard, that African American and Hispanics do not trust American medical community and do not participate in Alzheimer's clinical trials. Today's America cannot afford another dark chapter. This CED decision will fall particularly hard on the backs of people of color and rural communities who will effectively be denied access to this medication. We cannot let this happen. Jerry is dying a slow death with daily cuts and losses. It will not be the faster death of those living with aggressive cancers, but the end result is the same. The need for medication is no less. But like cancer, Alzheimer's is not a natural part of aging. Jerry inherited a gene from each parent, which has increased by 10 times the likelihood that she would develop Alzheimer's. She knows that she has passed this gene to her son and very possibly to her precious granddaughter. We know that possibly more promising drugs lay in the near horizon. Yet if this decision is allowed to stand, current regulations require that future drugs also be classified as CED. This is an outrage. Some calculate that this decision alone will delay future drugs from reaching the people who desperately need them by up to 2 years. In that time, over 700,000 Americans living with Alzheimer's will have passed through the stage of the disease when these future medications would have given them a better life. Time, delay. Do you not understand that time is exactly what we do not have? We are dying. Our situation is urgent, it is dire, and we are being victimized and trivialized. Jerry wants every additional day she can have to play with her granddaughter and to enjoy her advocacy, which has been a therapeutic experience for us both. The lack of urgency inherent in this CMS decision may even prevent her son from having a medication that will help him. So it's not only for the 6 million people living with AD today, but it's also for their progeny and for Jerry's granddaughter that we ask you listening in to join us, to raise your voice against this unconscionable CMS decision. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Jerry. And I want to pick up on something that you said and go back to also what Stephanie and Gretchen have been speaking to, which is, you know, there is a lot of stigma around Alzheimer's disease, and, you know, that has affected recognition within minority communities. And while your disease has been recognized, Jerry, a lot of people's are not. And in part, it's because there isn't an acknowledgement that Alzheimer's is not a normal part of aging. And I was wondering if folks could speak a little bit more to that. What do you all mean when we say Alzheimer's is not a normal part of aging? And what are some of the barriers to that in communities of color? And whoever wants to go, please, let's open it up.
Steph, do you want to speak first?
Sure. So I've spent a lot of time going throughout the country talking to people about Alzheimer's. I think we're in a much better place now in terms of individuals recognizing that brain changes aren't necessarily normal. The problem is getting doctors to take time with their patients and to make this as simple a question as how's your blood pressure, and they check your blood pressure, they check your heart, they listen to your lungs. There needs to be some routinization as part of the normal course of the medical workforce that says, let's do some cognition questions like we did for, I remember when you're having children and you come in and they count their fingers and the toes and they can sort of chart them in terms of normal child progression. We don't do that with adults, right? We don't ask about head injuries or other things that might indicate. We don't look at things that we know are potentially biomarkers for Alzheimer's, like vascular conditions, diabetes, and things of that nature. So we don't use the technologies that we have. We don't use the great mapping technologies that we have worked with NMQF on to actually pinpoint where people live, because we now understand that social determinants of health, people's zip codes are highly predictive of what their needs are. And then channeling resources into those communities to make sure that we are doing what we can to address brain health issues, to make sure we have good environments, that we have libraries and things like that, that haven't traditionally been thought of as being really important for healthcare, but we're understanding now that actually be one of the most predictive things in terms of what's going to happen with your brain and how you're able to interact. So using all of the resources and the knowledges coming out of the silos to enable communities both to understand what's happening in their communities and to understand how to empower doctors and nurses, which is something we've been working on, with information and ready to use kits like Us Against Alzheimer's Brain Guide, for example, which is a kit that people can use. It's a test that people can take advantage of to find out where are they. Is there a reason for concern? And then, give them resources that they can get through their doctor, through some national systems and things like that. So to be something that's really user friendly, in your hand, you get knowledge right now that you can then share with the doctor. We need a nationwide concerted effort to talk about brain health throughout the lifespan, and not just when people go in potentially in their 70s and 80s for a diagnosis that maybe could have been prevented.
Thank you.
Thanks. I agree with everything that Stephanie has said, and she spends much more time in community than I do. I would say what I would add to that, and what is the focus of the Institute for Equity, is the degree to which, once again, looking at sort of structural policy biases, the degree to which communities of color are not being identified as at risk for, or having, experiencing early cognitive impairment associated with Alzheimer's disease. And for me, and I'm not a scientist, but it speaks to biases that are documented in the peer-reviewed literature and different assessment tools. And so if the clinical community is within the context of what we know to be societal biases against particular population cohorts, are then reliant upon cognitive assessment tools that have biases built in to the algorithm, then regardless of the good intentions of the community or the willingness of the community to step forward, there's a structural barrier that impedes the increasing the intensity of activity within the clinical community to bring that patient into the treatment paradigm. So I would encourage us all to support everything Stephanie has said, but also make sure that the physicians, nurses, and others have the assessment tools they need to move us forward, because the community cannot address those issues. We have to be invited in. We have to be referred in, certainly.
If I could put just a fine point on this, this is so important, the structural issues, but others. I mean, essentially, with this decision and others, where we say we want inclusive, diverse trials to make sure that medications work well and are safe for all populations. But then we see incredibly small, less than 1% engagement sometimes of these communities. And we wonder, why is that? Is it the trust issue? Is it those issues? Well, yeah, a little bit is that, but much more what I have found is that our communities aren't being asked to participate in research. We're not reaching them. We're not using language to bring them in. We're not going to where they are. They may be seen by primary care doctors or community health center or churches and things like that. We're not going where they are. We're expecting them to come to a different place to ask a question that they might not even know is really a question for them to be asking. So that's the first thing, meeting them where they are. And then we say, and I know statistically about 80% of people when asked, say that are Black or Latino, say, yes, I'd love to participate in some clinical research. It may not be an infusion, it might be some other type of research, but I'd love to participate. So we've got them saying yes. And then they come to the door. If they can maneuver through the bus system and parking and taking off time from work and all of that stuff, they get to the door. And at the door, they're greeted with oh, I'm sorry, you have diabetes. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, you don't have a care partner who could also take off and be here with you. Oh, we're sorry. Oh, you're recovering from cancer. Oh, I'm sorry. So then you're told you're not good enough. You're not welcome, even though you've shown up. Does that instill more trust? I spent all my time navigating this system, and then you're going to shut the door on me again. So we've got to make an effort to basically, as we're doing good science, let's figure out what inclusion and exclusion criteria is really needed rather than nice to have, because there's going to be a give and take, right? And if trying to create this perfectly healthy person and then send a drug into a perfectly unhealthy environment, you don't really know how it's going to work on all different populations. So there's got to be some, confluence of an ability to talk about how we manage this, how we make sure that it's reaching the populations, that we know that it's safe, that it's effective, that it works the same in all populations. It might work better if we bring in more populations in certain populations than others. The dosage might be different, but it's got to be an all hands on deck effort. And personally, I feel like, this approach is sort of like the stopgap measure that if they didn't set these inclusion criteria, they didn't set these percentages up where it should have been set, and now they're going to slam the door shut right when there was hope to the community. And I think, this is a process foul in addition to being just bad policy that we need to be talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing I would add to that, fine point on fine point, is that there's lots of sort of parsing of bias as intentional or unintentional. The fact of the matter is that those who make policy, those who are empowered politically and economically to change or reinforce behavior, are aware of exactly what Stephanie is speaking to and what Jim is speaking to and what I am speaking to. So when you have that knowledge and then you still make these kinds of decisions, by definition, that's intentional. And that intentionality is problematic. And we need to look at not only political responses to that, but the degree to which there may be legal responses to that, I think needs to be explored as well.
Gretchen, I think that's all said. And thank you very much, Stephanie, for beautifully articulating some of the major impediments we have. It's so frustrating for us to encounter the stigma that people don't recognize this is not a normal part of aging in government institutions that still do not understand this is a normal part of aging. It is not. And, we were talking about there's a great need for cognitive evaluation. We are entitled in our Medicare, as members of Medicare, as I understand it, to an annual cognitive evaluation in our annual cognitive assessment, health review. And yet it is not given unless we call ahead and request it. People don't even know to do that. My GP doesn't even give cognitive evaluations. But if we call ahead and make the office aware, they are required to give us a cognitive evaluation that at least sets a baseline. And it doesn't matter if you're Caucasian or African American or Hispanic American, you are entitled to this cognitive evaluation. We must get the word out there and let people know that they need a baseline so we can track their cognitive decline. And it's a right we all have, and it's one that we must take advantage of.
Yeah. Jim, Jerry, Stephanie, Gretchen, thank you so much. This was a really great panel. I do think as we go along in the discussions today, we should also be talking about the PET imaging CED, which CMS has had for a number of years. And it's the exact same situation as what I mentioned in my opening remarks. They have used the issue of not enough minority participation to drag it out further. So to your point, Gretchen, for recognition, for diagnosis, it's happening there as well. And it is alarming and it's systemic. So thank you all. We're going to start our second panel at 1:50 and look forward to seeing you in a few minutes. So have a good break. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hi. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming back. Our second panel for today is going to tackle the impact of CMS's decision on medical innovation. Our esteemed panelists include Dr. Jeffrey Cummings, who's director of the Chambers-Grundy Center for Transformative Neuroscience at UNLV, and one of the leading global experts on clinical development in Alzheimer's disease. Dr. Gaurav Gupta, founder of Ascendant BioCapital, a life sciences investment firm based in New York, and Tom Mathers, co-founder of Allevex Corporation and serves as its president and CEO and director. And he's also a partner of Pappas Capital. Welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for being here today. Dr. Cummings, Dr. Gupta, and Tom, please give us your take on CMS's decision and what has you concerned. Dr. Cummings, let's start with you.
Okay, thanks, Sue. Really great to be on the panel, and I feel fortunate to share this panel with my colleagues. As you mentioned, I'm a clinical trialist, long experience in clinical trials and drug development at UCLA and Cleveland Clinic and now at UNLV. I have summarized my comments about the CMS proposed document on the public comment so people can go there and look at those if they want. I'm going to be brief in summarizing what I think are some of the major problems that the CMS proposed program raises. First and foremost, as a neurologist, I'm concerned about the lack of availability to my patients. This is an approved drug. Certainly the development program was irregular, but I think the data are there. They're certainly there sufficiently to satisfy the requirements of accelerated approval, and my patient should have it, and it should be paid for. So that's my first and major concern. Another, I would say, is the lack of equity that the current program would create. Patients who cannot pay for the medication could get it only through participation in a clinical trial. Patients who have sufficient means can buy the medication. That makes a clinical trial a coercive exercise. It weaponizes clinical trials in a way that we have never seen before. So I think that is unacceptable to have poor people required to be in a clinical trial to get a drug, and wealthy people can buy it on the market. The idea of extending this to monoclonal antibodies generally is also, I think, a drawback of this proposal. We have no comparative information so far. We know that they're directed to different epitopes. We know that they have different means of administration. They have different half-lives. They have different titration schedules. And we have no idea whether these things affect the occurrence of ARIA, which we are all worried about, and we have strategies to manage, or whether it affects efficacy. So I think the broad sweep of putting all the monoclonals together is one that it would be a setback to the field. I'll just finish by saying that I led the group that put together the appropriate use recommendations for aducanumab. I'm proud to say that they have been downloaded 17,000 times so far from the website, so they're having some impact. Our main goal there was to make sure that aducanumab could be provided safely, because there is a concern about amyloid-related imaging abnormalities. The serious consequences are rare. It was 0.3% in the ENGAGE and EMERGE trials. But of course, the occurrence of ARIA itself is much more common than that. It occurred in about 35% of the patients in the trial. So it must be monitored. We have to be on top of the management of it. But there are strategies, and the consequences can be minimized. And I think it should be part of the education of a patient who is considering treatment with aducanumab. But it is not a reason to restrict it in the way that CMS has proposed. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Dr. Gupta.
Hi, Sue. Thanks for having me today, and pleasure to be here. Thank you, Dr. Cummings, for some of the points you made, which I think are really important from the perspective of the prescribing physicians. As a physician myself, and now someone who focuses on investing in biotechnology companies that are working to develop diseases to, help patients, with some of our worst afflictions, including Alzheimer's disease. What's troubling to me about the CMS decision is the fact that there are no clinicians or scientists that work at CMS. The United States FDA is the global gold standard regulator for new medical product approvals, and the regulatory science, the standards the FDA has established over decades include transparency, include dialogue with drug makers and with patients. And this is not something CMS is equipped to do. And I think it's troubling that they are, elbowing into these kinds of decisions, which really go above and beyond what could be simply an interagency turf battle in Washington, to having real ramifications for how, companies are going to approach developing drugs in the future. I mean, biotechnology companies, cannot operate in an unstable regulatory and reimbursement environment. They cannot successfully access capital. This will be very destabilizing to a lot of programs that hold a lot of promise. There's two specific things about the CMS decision that bother me and I think are overly broad. One is it didn't just specifically focus on one drug. It focused on an entire class of drugs that target a protein called amyloid, which Dr. Cummings referenced. And amyloid is indisputably the biological hallmark of Alzheimer's disease, and it's a shocking overreach for a bureaucrat to elbow in and cast a wide net to cover an entire biological target. And I think the second thing about the CMS decision is that they did not specifically provide any guidance. They said that they wanted to see health outcomes data. Dr. Cummings referenced that the FDA accelerated approval process was used here, which sort of specifically does not rely on clinical outcomes data. And by saying that in the CMS NCD draft, they presume to sort of instruct the FDA and drug development organizations and companies with what kind of health outcomes data they're looking for. But they actually used very vague language that does not constitute a dialogue. And I think it just shows their lack of rigor in their understanding of the real issues facing people like Dr. Cummings and the companies that Tom and I work with. So I'll pause there, but thank you for the opportunity to comment.
Oh, these are great comments. Thank you both so much. Tom.
Hi, thanks, Sue. And my name is Tom Mathers. I'm a longtime biotech entrepreneur and drug developer, and I'm also, as you mentioned, a partner at Pappas Capital, where my primary role is company formation to develop new therapies. In late 2019, I formed a new company, Allevex Corporation, which I currently serve as president and CEO. And we're working on a novel therapeutic for the treatment of Sanfilippo syndrome. And you're probably asking, well, why is some guy sitting here talking about Sanfilippo syndrome when we're really discussing a pillow fight between FDA and CMS over aducanumab? Well, Sanfilippo syndrome is a devastating and cruel pediatric disease, 100% fatal. These children, about 4,000 of them worldwide, are born with a gene mutation, which leads them to lack an enzyme that breaks down a sugar, which accumulates in the brain, called heparan sulfate. And this heparan sulfate accumulation is highly toxic to neurons. And it leads to just this incredibly dementing disease, which many people in the press will call pediatric Alzheimer's. What we've been doing at Allevex is we manufacture the missing enzyme that's used to break down the sugar, and we actually deliver it directly into the brains of these children using a catheter system. And we do that once a week. And we've been treating children now for several years, and we see remarkable progress. But much like Alzheimer's, a disease like Sanfilippo syndrome is a disease of decaying neurocognition and neurodegeneration. And it takes a long time to demonstrate a treatment effect above what you would see in the natural history. So whether it's Alzheimer's, which is a slowly progressing disease, as we all know, or Sanfilippo syndrome, which is also a slowly progressive disease, it just takes time. It could take 5 years of treatment to see a significant difference. For us, we rely on biomarkers that are reasonably likely to predict that clinical benefit at 5 years. If we can eliminate that toxic sugar in the brain, you can hopefully prevent the onset and fatality of these children. This is why the accelerated approval process is so near and dear to our industry, and so near and dear to capital formation, as Dr. Gupta talked about in our industry. This CMS decision is a tremendous overreach, not only for Alzheimer's research and aducanumab and amyloid targeting therapies, but it absolutely can have spillover effect into diseases such as Sanfilippo, where we absolutely need the accelerated approval process to deliver this potentially life-saving treatment for these children who are doomed to die on average by the age of 19. So for me, this CMS decision is not just about aducanumab. It's not just about amyloid targeting therapies. It is about taking away one of the most important and powerful tools we have in drug development, the accelerated approval process.
Wow. Okay, thank you, all of you. I have a couple of questions for you. And I just want to reflect that it is clear as we've been working on this issue that CMS does not seem to get the purpose of the accelerated approval program as not being for first-line therapies, right? It's not, you know, it's for things where you don't have any other options. So we'll touch on these things a little bit more. So Dr. Cummings, my first question is, in the litany of coverage over aducanumab, what's been absent is that for the first time ever, the FDA approved a drug that they believe can provide some delay to the progression of Alzheimer's disease for patients in the early stages of cognitive decline. Can you give the audience a bit more context about that and what precedent this decision sets for future research into the disease?
Yes, thanks, Sue. This is a moment we should be celebrating, right? This is the first disease-modifying therapy for Alzheimer's disease, and except for one drug in ALS, it is the first disease-modifying drug for any of the adult neurodegenerative disorders. So this is a new era of Alzheimer's disease therapy, and it has been since 2003 that the last drug was approved for Alzheimer's disease. And the drugs that were approved in that era of 1995 to 2003 were all symptomatic drugs. That is, the point was to improve the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, but they did not change the overall decline of Alzheimer's disease. The importance of drugs like aducanumab and the other monoclonals that are close behind it is that they change the trajectory of decline and slow the disease. They don't improve patients. That's very important for patients to realize. They're not going to get better. However, they're going to lose function at a much slower rate than if they were not treated. So it's very, very important. It's why we're starting treatment very early, because if we can have patients who start early and progress very slowly, then they can remain at a reasonable functional level for a pretty long period of time. Now, I want to be careful not to overstate. The aducanumab effect was 30% in the people who were on the high dose for 14 months. And that was true of both trials, by the way. There's a lot of controversy about this, but when you look at the group that had the appropriate exposure at the appropriate dose, both trials had exactly or very, very nearly the same slowing. So a 30% slowing, that's important, that's meaningful. That means that if I had MCI, I would be in the MCI stage for at least one additional year before I crossed that line into the terminal dementia phase of Alzheimer's disease. So the disease modification era, which has begun, is really, really important, really exciting, and I am sorry that it has been introduced in such a tumultuous way when we should be celebrating.
Yes, yes. Okay, so Dr. Gupta, it takes billions of dollars to develop just one single drug. And as the founder of a biotech investment firm, we'd love to hear more from you about how a decision like this one from CMS is going to transform the perspective of investors who are planning to enter the space. So from your point of view, what's that going to look like moving forward?
Well, I'd like to set the stage by borrowing some numbers that actually Dr. Cummings published in a journal article last year, where he looked back at the attempts made to develop Alzheimer's drugs since 1995, which he referenced in his comments as well. But in his estimation, I think this is a valid estimation, since 1995, biopharma companies have spent over $40 billion studying Alzheimer's disease therapy. And in that time, they've set up nearly 1,100 clinical trials and enrolled over 180,000 patients into those clinical trials. Thank you, Dr. Cummings, for putting that in the public domain. What's important is, as he said, that there's only 6 drugs that were approved in that span, and they were all symptomatic treatments and not disease-modifying drugs or cures, as we would hope. But I hope the scope of those numbers really underscores that the biopharmaceutical industry really bears extraordinary financial risks in the pursuit of breakthroughs for the most catastrophic diseases that affect all of us. And the reason that that is possible is because of the guardrails that have existed around reimbursement of successful drugs as determined by the FDA. So the CMS provides insurance coverage for over 100 million Americans, including, in this case, millions of Alzheimer's disease patients. And by law and by tradition, but most importantly by law, Medicare Part B must cover medicines that are reasonable and necessary to treat a patient and cannot decline to cover an FDA-approved drug. So this creates at least a predictable way to assess the risk-reward benefit in making investment decisions that has led the biopharmaceutical industry to risk, $40 billion of capital in the last, since 1995, in the last several decades, to make those kinds of decisions, and that now has led us from a scientific perspective to the place that Dr. Cummings described, where we do have data from a medicine that the FDA was approved based on a biomarker endpoint using the accelerated approval pathway. And I'll wrap by saying I think the prospect of CMS transforming itself into, again, an unaccountable kind of shadow regulatory body and a de facto alternate approval process where, again, it's the lack of dialogue that the FDA has historically had with drug makers, with patients, et cetera, that makes them the gold standard agency. I think that is tremendously destabilizing from an investment decision-making perspective. And I think that companies are going to have difficulty accessing capital and also just simply operating in a very uncertain regulatory and reimbursement environment.
Yeah, thank you. So Tom, I know you touched on this a bit already, but it's really so important to reiterate that this decision isn't just going to impact Alzheimer's patients and that it could completely undermine the broader drug approval process too. As someone who's working directly on a new treatment for rare disease, can you provide more insight as to what that means for you, for your company,
Sure.
and for your progress?
Absolutely. I mean, thanks to Dr. Cummings to really reviewing the data on aducanumab, and I don't know it nearly as well as he does, and that's not why I'm here today. I know the folks in Office of Neuroscience at FDA. I've been in front of that group for multiple projects. The last drug that I developed to get approved was through that office as well. I can tell you they are rigorous, they are thoughtful, but they are tough. And regardless of what the data are that Dr. Cummings reviewed, I am certain that, as Dr. Gupta said, the gold standard of the FDA adjudicated the risk-benefit under the accelerated approval pathway to approve aducanumab. And so for anyone to second guess that destabilizes the underpinnings of our drug development process and really calls into question, if you're a reviewer at FDA and you have a new drug for neurodegeneration or neurocognition, such as what we're working on, what is your motivation to approve anything under accelerated approval if you believe that there's going to be a second judgment that will slap it down and render the drug basically unusable by the most vulnerable populations? So for me, as Dr. Gupta was saying, this is extraordinarily destabilizing. My investors demand certainty in regulatory environment, and there's a set of rules that we operate under that we can assess risk and make investments into these novel treatments. If you destabilize that, investors will balk at investing there and go put their money in some other sector where they have more defined risk. But most importantly, what I know are the 22 children we currently are treating with Sanfilippo syndrome. And what I can tell you are, in some children, the results are extraordinary. We have a little girl whose older brother that we identified through genetic testing. We started treating him. He had already begun this precipitous decline with neurodegeneration and loss of cognition, but we were able to catch it almost like catching a falling knife. And as Dr. Cummings said, stabilize that patient. Fortunately, we identified his younger sister, a younger sibling. She was tested when she was only 1 year old, and she was discovered to have the same mutation. We started treating her right in the very beginning. She now is a normal 6-year-old girl. She speaks 2 languages. She goes to school, and she asks her mom on the way to the hospital for a weekly treatment, why do I have to go to the hospital if I'm not sick? So this is the promise of accelerated approval, that we can get these new medicines in neurodegeneration and diseases of cognition to our most vulnerable patient population in a thoughtful and rigorous way. And I'll remind everyone that the sponsor of aducanumab, Biogen, made a commitment to the FDA to confirm the clinical benefit that was predicted by the accelerated approval process, and they have a plan to do so, just as that program was set up to do. The sponsor made that commitment to the FDA. This is completely destabilizing for these new types of treatments, and obviously you can tell I'm passionate about this and frustrated by this, and it just has to change.
Yeah, we're frustrated by
Can I
it too.
comment on this innovation piece? It's so interesting to me that Lilly has already announced that they are slowing the progress of donanemab because of the uncertainty created by CMS. So you see right away the negative impact on the Alzheimer's disease field from what has happened with aducanumab. So there's just no question about the adverse effects from a financial and investment point of view of this decision.
One thing I worry a little bit is I don't want to come across as sounding whiny. It's our responsibility as drug developers to prove the safety and efficacy of the drugs that we develop. And in diseases like Alzheimer's or Sanfilippo syndrome, as I mentioned from the outset, these are diseases of a long runway. It just takes time. And that's why this CMS decision to completely undermine FDA's decision, utilizing a validated and legal tool, accelerated approval process, and having motivated and committed sponsors who will spend billions of dollars to confirm clinical benefit with these drugs. To take that away really is such a disservice to the patients who really need these treatments.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question, because I feel like a lot of people don't understand how kind of clinical development changes over time, and the importance of a tool like accelerated approval to introduce, something new to populations that have nothing else, and how it can help spur better drugs as you move along. So can you all, expound upon that a bit? Because if you're sort of cutting off the first in class at the knees, what's the impact on that for, improving things over time? I know that cancer treatments have changed dramatically in the last several decades. So just tell us a little bit more about that.
Let me give you one example, if I may. Beta-Seron was approved with accelerated approval in 1983. That's how long the tool has been around. It was approved on the basis of MRI findings where that weren't quite yet connected to the clinical benefit. So it's exactly this window of what accelerated approval is supposed to do. Since then, there have been 15 disease-modifying therapies developed for multiple sclerosis. That's because CMS paid for it. Investors saw the ability to get a return on investment. The drugs were invented and tested. The field moved ahead. That's what it requires. That's the ecology of drug development, which is an interactive ecology between the financial community and the scientific community. And both of those have to thrive in order to make drug development win. We saw it in multiple sclerosis. We can see it in Alzheimer's disease if we don't cut it off at its knees, as you said.
Gaurav, do you have anything you want to add?
So, the accelerated approval pathway has become controversial, but I think it's important to remind, and I think that's for the wrong reasons. And as Tom said, it's our job to communicate why this pathway is so important for patients. But I think it's also important to remind ourselves, this pathway was established in 1992. So it's, there's a long history to look back on and convince ourselves that it is actually an important tool. And it was established to address what we, call today unmet needs for serious or life-threatening diseases. And because the FDA is the gold standard regulator, the bar for approving drugs is incredibly high. And the accelerated approval pathway allows for true scientific advances to make their ways to patients much more rapidly. And I think it's important that we figure out how to preserve that value in our system. That, science is moving rapidly. In the last decade, several new product formats have been approved, spanning gene therapy, cell therapy, oligonucleotide therapy, of course, things like mRNA vaccines, but even covering things like bispecific antibodies. Soon around the corner, we have the prospect of things like targeted protein degradation and gene editing. And as the pace of science moves, the regulatory science should adapt with it and should allow, there should be a partnership and a dialogue that permits these advances to make their way to patients as rapidly as possible, rather than simply being, overly conservative pertaining to safety and other considerations that I think historically it's viewed that the FDA was, and part of the reason they developed these nimble pathways. So I think, we should take a step back and focus on the positives that Dr. Cummings did a very nice job articulating an important historical example, but I think there's several. If we take a step back and think about writ large, these nimble pathways are a good thing for our society and all of our friends and family who are patients.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Tom.
No, I can't say anything better than Dr. Gupta said. And I always wanted to work into a panel, the writ large. That's amazing. It's true. And I think if you look outside of neurodegeneration and oncology, just the sheer power of accelerated approval and driving new advances to the oncology field, it's remarkable. And who's to say that this decision doesn't spill over into oncology as well? Again, if you're an FDA reviewer and you're trained to be highly critical and conservative, that's why we are the gold standard in regulatory approvals on a global basis. Your motivation to push something or to approve something under the accelerated approval pathway is limited, because if you don't think there's ever going to be reimbursement, kind of the agreement we have with our government and the way CMS works, then you're not motivated, or you're discouraged in kind of a perverse way from really contemplating a breakthrough therapy under the accelerated approval pathway. And you sit around and wait for 5 more years to confirm that clinical benefit, which would have been done anyway by the sponsor under accelerated approval.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So this is, if I could just add one thing, I think this is part of this dialogue between access and cost. And although CMS is not supposed to consider cost, I think we've seen a social response to the high cost of aducanumab. But I would take the position that limiting its availability is not the way to bring the cost down. The way to bring the cost down is to allow competition to occur, allow these other monoclonals to come into the market as they prove themselves, and create an environment where cost can be considered realistically. So I think there is a dialogue to be had there, but this is not the way to have that dialogue.
Yep. I think that's a great way for us to wrap up this second panel. We are going to take a break for 10 minutes and come back at 2:30. So thanks to all our panelists. This was really engaging, and I think probably taught folks who were tuning in a lot about clinical development. So thanks to all of you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for this opportunity. Have a great day.
You too. Hi, everybody, and welcome back. And thank you so much for spending all this time with us today. There's a lot of issues to get through. Our third and final panel today is going to seek to answer whether CMS is aspiring to become a second drug approval agency. Our panelists include John Dwyer, who is president of the Global Alzheimer's Platform Foundation, Kelly Cleary, partner at Aiken Gump and former Deputy General Counsel at HHS and Chief Legal Officer for CMS, and Priya Narona Pinto, partner at King & Spalding, who previously served as HHS Acting General Counsel and a Department of Justice litigator and has been working with us in the AD Policy Task Force, which we greatly appreciate. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for being here with us today. John, Kelly, Priya, what are your initial thoughts on CMS's decision and the disconnect with the FDA's approval decision? John?
Thank you, Sue, for inviting me to speak. My initial impression is that the FDA has the statutory authority here, that they've been empowered by Congress to take on exactly the kind of case that Aduhelm represents, and that they found that it was reasonably likely to predict a clinical benefit when you modify beta amyloid plaque as a surrogate endpoint. The reasons that, and we can go into it in a bit, that I think CMS has taken this different tack are really quite disturbing from a point of view of not just overreaching, but trying to effectuate a policy decision that is in fact requiring a much more robust statutory solution than trying to use the back door of rationing care. And that is really what's happening here. This restriction represented by the proposed draft NCD is really much more an effort to say there's a very large class of patients that could benefit from this drug, and we're going to clamp it down and reduce the hit to the system.
Thank you, John. Kelly?
Thanks, Sue. I agree that it's problematic. As you had mentioned, I did, like Priya, spend some time in the department, and as lawyers, a lot of what we did, or a big part of what we did, was trying to ensure that whatever the agency was doing was kind of within the bounds of the authority that Congress conferred on them. So that's the lens that I'm looking at this coverage decision through, and this very aptly worded question you had, is CMS becoming a second drug approval agency? Through the lens that I look at, are they doing it, and should they be doing it? And I do think there are problems with their authority here, primarily with the entire coverage with evidence development paradigm itself. I think there are real questions about the validity of that authority. Can CMS really be conditioning coverage for Medicare patients on their participation in the clinical trial? Is the authority that they are relying on sufficient? They cite a provision in the Social Security Act that essentially says even if CMS doesn't think that something's reasonable and necessary to treat an illness, we can still pay for it if it's reasonable and necessary to for purposes of research being conducted or supported by AHRQ, the Agency for Healthcare Research. Well, as I read the decision, I didn't see that AHRQ was funding the study. I don't see how AHRQ is conducting the study. And so what is AHRQ doing to support this study? Because they need to support it in order for this legal theory to work out. So I think it's one of those things, if you start to pull the thread a little bit, the sweater unravels. And that they're applying the CED paradigm in an entirely new way to a drug that, as John was saying, is approved by the FDA and has been determined to be safe and effective. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Priya?
Hi, Sue. Thanks for having me. I completely agree with John and with Kelly. As a lawyer, I also agree that there are serious deficiencies with CMS's use of the CED authority. And I think just big picture too here, I think the proposed NCD really is a significant departure from how the Medicare program has historically approached coverage of FDA-approved drugs for on-label indications. This proposed decision signals that FDA approval of a drug no longer means that Medicare coverage is expected, which is historically how that has really occurred. And as we know, Medicare coverage is a prerequisite for patient access. So I think if CMS proceeds down this path, I predict there will be some major changes in how manufacturers approach development of innovative drugs and biologics, which will result in longer timeframes to get these therapies to market. And this is squarely opposed to the purpose of accelerated approval and similar FDA regulatory pathways that Congress has established and that FDA administers. So I think that's going to be a serious problem that we need to address.
These are all excellent points. I find this very intriguing. So John, my first question is for you, which is in the previous session, we learned about the impact of the CMS decision on the early stages of drug development. But we'd love to hear more from you about how this decision will influence the later stages of drug development and introduce additional uncertainty, specifically related to the clinical trial and FDA approval processes for Alzheimer's treatment. Can you tell everybody more about that?
Yes, I can, once I unmute. First, I want to stipulate that my colleagues on this panel are heads and shoulders better lawyers than I am. So the last 30 years I've spent as a serial entrepreneur, in some respects was more comfortable with the previous panel than I am with this panel. But in the last 7 years, my organization has spent a fair amount of time developing first one of the best networks of clinical trial sites for Alzheimer's research, and then conducted or is conducting 12 Alzheimer's trials right now. So we're in the field. We have the guts and the blood and guts of actually trying to get trials done under our fingernails. And these are very difficult trials. So I wanted to start because I'd love my colleagues to react to this. Some of our colleagues, and I associate myself with these remarks, have decried the CMS decision as a form of discrimination. Now, the black and white definition of discrimination is when similarly situated folks are brought to bear before the government and get a very different material outcome. Why is that? And I want to go to the similarly situated question. We did some analysis. This is brand new data for all of you listening, that we have at least. 75 drugs in the last 10 years were approved through AAP and then subsequently given coverage by CMS. You can quibble about that number a little bit, but that's a really solid number. 24% of those, see, everybody says safety is a big issue with aducanumab, and my mentor, Jeff Cummings, has spoken to that a little bit. 24% of that 75 drugs had a black box warning on it, and they still covered it. 9% had a REMS component to those drugs, and they still covered it. Of those folks in that category, prices, which we're saying aren't an issue, prices in that group had a range of a high of $2.57 million to a low of $339, and the median was $313 per drug. Aducanumab at $28,200, while a very significant number, is in fact in the lowest quartile. It's ninth out of the 75. So this isn't about safety in the first instance, in my humble opinion. And it is also not about the price. In terms of the statutory construct and what prior administrations and administrators have behaved. It's about the size of the patient pool. There are just too many Alzheimer's patients. When you look at trying to pay for hundreds of thousands or 1 million people that could be benefited by this drug, it causes the agency a great deal of agita. And I think that that is clearly in play, and why I previously started with rationing. And just to hit a conclusion in case my internet should suddenly buckle, is Alzheimer's patients cannot, will not idly sit by and take this. This is not going to stop here. And I'd like to just add, I want to thank the House of Representatives for their letter today. Their letter has profoundly important questions that inform this panel and that discussion. And yes, this is a case of first impression. We've never had an NCD with this kind of a randomized clinical trial presented to us. We've never seen this precedent where a drug was AAP'd, accelerated pathway, and then they didn't cover. And the House is well right to be concerned about what is going on here. And I will stop there, and we can talk about some of the implications for future trials, but Jeff was right. Lilly's already changed its behavior. It will not be the last if we don't get harmonized and consistent in ours and all indications. And this lack of equilibrium is devastating.
Yeah, that was great. I'm gonna, before we launch into the next question, I'm gonna actually ask Priya and Kelly for your reactions to any one or more of the points that John just made. As Jerry Seinfeld would say, that's a big matzo ball that you left hanging out there.
Well,
Kelly?
happy to chime in first. I mean, I totally agree, like that this is about cost. No one asked for this NCD. There was no formal request. The agency decided to do it sua sponte, and you can't ignore the fact that these CED decisions are increasingly trending toward arising in the case of expensive new medical technologies. And again, is that it's a problem. You know, how are we going to pay for these things? But is it a problem that should be solved in this way? It is restricting access to care. CED, contrary to what the agency says sometimes, is not about expanding care that would expanding access to things that would otherwise be foreclosed. That's not the case here, and that's not the case with some of the other CED coverage decisions that have come down in recent years. If the problem is the payment mechanism under Part B that we're paying for new therapies at ASP +6, that's something for Congress to solve. But that is the program that we have now. And using this coverage process as a way to address a problem that's really Congress's to solve, I find that kind of concerning and problematic.
Yeah, I agree with Kelly's remarks. I would also just add, CMS's statutory standard is reasonable and necessary. Cost is not a component of that. They have tried in the past to incorporate cost as a component of reasonable and necessary, and the courts have struck them down. If anyone recalls the whole least costly alternative controversies of about 10 years ago. So they are not supposed to consider cost. And, honestly, they have said that they haven't. But again, they're a payer like any other. So I don't know how cost cannot be a determination here. It really shouldn't be. But I agree, it's something that Congress should step in and address, because the standards are as they are, and CMS is mandated with applying them as they are written.
Okay, so Kelly, we've, I think, pretty much established that it's unprecedented for CMS to intervene in this manner. If you draw on your experience working at CMS and HHS, can you give us a bit of an insider's insight into the broader relationship between the two agencies and what sort of precedent this sets moving forward, and how do we fix this?
The last one's a tough one. But in terms of the broader relationship, I mean, I think when it comes to innovation, and I don't want to speak for my colleagues at FDA, but I think that CMS and FDA, they view their roles and responsibilities as being very different. The FDA is the gatekeeper, what gets to come onto the market. and CMS, their role is to ensure that Medicare is not paying for things that are not reasonable and necessary. And they've gone to great lengths to distinguish the FDA safety and efficacy standard from the Social Security Act's reasonable and necessary standard. And you know, courts have, for the most part, been very permissive in this regard. And I think that is, that's emboldened the agency in a lot of ways to stretch their authorities further. But CMS does watch what FDA is doing very closely. They know the drugs that are coming through the pipeline, and they know that they're going to have to take into account, you know, not only the FDA's labeling, but the conclusions that the FDA has drawn on safety and efficacy. They are, and sometimes, depending on who you talk to, that they might disagree, but these are not two independent agencies. They are both part of HHS. So that, you know, makes it even more important that, you know, that they're speaking with one voice. And I do think that they try to do that, because it is the Secretary's authority. It's not the FDA Commissioner's authority or the CMS Administrator's authority. It's the Secretary's authority. So they do have to pay attention to what the other ones is doing. I think CMS, to a greater extent, has to be cognizant of what the FDA is doing and tailor its approach accordingly.
Thank you. Yep. So Priya, building on what Kelly just shared, and from your experience both in government and then the private sector, how would you say that CMS's decision changes the calculus for firms that are currently working with the FDA to gain approval for potentially game-changing treatments? And what additional hurdles do you think this regulatory uncertainty introduces for both regulators and scientists working on new treatments?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, you know, I spend my practice right now working with primarily pharmaceutical and medical device manufacturers, designing and executing reimbursement strategies to get their innovative products to patients. And, you know, as I said before, I think CMS in this proposed decision is really shifting its historical approach to Medicare coverage of FDA-approved drugs and biologics. Up until now, Medicare really, you know, deferred to the FDA approval decision. On-label indications were generally covered. And, you know, clients historically come to me with questions about, you know, which benefit would the drug fall under? Would it be the medical benefit versus the pharmacy benefit? Or else, you know, questions would come up about, you know, coverage of off-label indications, which is more of a tricky area since, of course, FDA doesn't allow promotion of those indications, but Medicare does cover them where the clinical evidence supports it. But here we've got a different situation. We've got FDA approval of a product under the accelerated approval pathway, which is an expedited pathway created by Congress that allows FDA to review more quickly drugs that are intended to treat serious conditions that fill an unmet medical need. So the point is to get needed therapies to patients faster where there are no other options. And I think in this decision, what CMS is signaling that they're doing is essentially applying a different standard to accelerated approval drugs than they do to drugs approved under standard approval pathways. So then your question is, you know, what are manufacturers going to do about this? Unfortunately, I think one option is not use accelerated approval, even though it is available to them. It's, you know, unfortunate, but it's not unheard of. We've seen this on the medical device side quite a bit. You can get a device to market much faster using what we call a tool claim under the 510K pathway, but that won't be enough for reimbursement. So manufacturers very often opt for more rigorous PMA or de novo processes, which is a longer pathway. More clinical studies are needed, but there's a higher chance of reimbursement upon marketing authorization. So, you know, is this the right result? Well, I don't think so, because it defeats the purpose of the congressionally created expedited pathway to get needed therapies to patients faster where they don't have any other options. And I think, you know, to Kelly's point, the Secretary of HHS really should be concerned about this because, you know, there is a overall policy goal that HHS does speak in one voice. And in the Bush administration, you know, we had a mantra, one HHS. We have to make our decisions consistent among all the agencies. And I think Congress also should be very concerned about where this is going. And I think it also injects a level of uncertainty into the whole clinical development process around drug products, since the guidance that FDA is going to give manufacturers and clinical developers regarding what evidence is needed is not going to be enough to ensure patient access. And again, this is not a new issue. Device manufacturers have been fighting it for years and years. We took a step forward with the new breakthrough device Medicare coverage pathway that was finalized in the last administration, but then it was repealed. So we're back to square one with devices. I really, do not want to see us going backwards with drugs as well. We talked about the different standards. I completely agree. From a legal perspective, safe and effective and reasonable and necessary, they are different legal standards. But from a policy perspective, we can't have these needed treatments for serious medical conditions approved through special pathways created where there aren't any other options on the market for months, sometimes years, with patients unable to use them. I think, FDA and CMS really need to sit at the same table and find ways to move patient care forward. I know efforts have been made in the past with parallel review and similar types of programs, but I think this should really be made a priority in the Biden administration, and our patients deserve it. We deserve no less.
Excellent. Yeah, Kelly, I wanted to sort of follow up on what Priya was talking about with just kind of the disconnect and how, so FDA has accelerated approval. The idea is to get out medications a little faster. You are trading a bit around certainty and risk to get them out, but they're specifically for folks that don't have any other options and have life-threatening conditions. And there are these follow-up requirements that are pretty strict. You alluded to how when CED was originally created, that was the idea, was to, okay, let's get this out quicker, right? But that has not been the result of what's happened. So talk to us a little bit more about that and why you think that's the case.
Well, I think that and again, a lot of this evolved in the device space where some devices were not getting, and Priya can correct me, I'm not an FDA practitioner, but one type of pre-market approval, there are two different types of pre-market approval, and one of them is less rigorous than the other. Okay, devices were coming on the market with the less rigorous going through the less rigorous pre-market approval process, and CMS said that they were basically dissatisfied with the kind of evidentiary development. And interestingly, one of their justifications for requiring additional evidence development was insufficient participation by Medicare beneficiaries. So this new technology might be great for the general population, but we don't know how it's going to affect Medicare beneficiaries, and that has justified a lot of the CED decisions in the past. And I think that some of these CED decisions have also come on the heels of some of the local contractors denying coverage. So some of these, there really were instances of beneficiaries not getting any access to therapies, and CMS would step in to try to create some access where maybe previously there was none. But as you saw with CAR-T, I was there when we issued the coverage decision for CAR-T. There really weren't too many problems at that point with the local coverage of CAR-T therapies. It was being paid for. Enter United Health, who requested the NCD, and at least for the proposed NCD, the proposal was to restrict coverage to coverage with evidence development, and there was a lot of pushback, and ultimately the agency stood down. Maybe that will happen here, but they've come out again. Similarly, that the drug is before local contractors have even had a chance to say yay or nay, they're restricting access. And here, another reason why it's so precedent setting is they can't say that there was not enough participation among the Medicare population. I think I read that 80% of the clinical trial participants were age 65 or older. So that is really treading new ground for CMS in the CED space, because they can't say that the participation's the problem, and they don't know how it translates to the Medicare population. So it's really just a head-on disagreement with the entire evidentiary base itself.
Wow, yes. Yeah, and John, I know that some of the stated clinical trial exclusion criteria in the proposed decision would also cut out folks with multiple chronic conditions, and they've talked about folks with Down syndrome would not be able to participate. Tell us just a little bit more from your perspective in the work that you try to do every day with GAP. What that says to you. I mean, they're saying they want a representative population. What does that mean?
Well, I think the whole field is grappling with and needs to up its game in enrolling diverse populations. The goal is absolutely appropriate. And you need to know therapies work for all beneficiaries, not just a subset of the beneficiaries. I do want to say clearly, though, so we don't lose this thread, and I don't think my colleagues meant to lose it. After the FDA approved this thing, this was between docs and patients. And whether Medicare pays for it or not, there are going to be people that get on this approved drug that's in the marketplace lawfully. And it's only going to be the rich or the handful that can figure out a way to get underwritten by either the company or foundations. That is nuts. That is terrible policy. And usually terrible policy leads to terrible politics. Back to that great letter we got today. In the context of how they've designed the trial, they have done two things actually that we need to focus on. First, they've put in play the whole beta amyloid cascade, a subject matter that has received, between the NIH and private industry, billions and billions of dollars of research. And all of a sudden, CMS, after reading 250 articles, is in a place to unwind all that. And I'll stipulate their heart is pure and they're as smart as anybody needs to be, but this decision that was musing about, I can't call it dicta, was musing about maybe it's just a normal outgrowth of aging, is so wrong-headed, it's almost impossible for people like Jeff Cummings to even get his head wrapped around, or any of us that are patient advocates. That's a problem because Down syndrome's affected, every drug that's in the pipeline's affected. If there's really a belief over at the agency that the mechanism of action doesn't equate to reasonable and necessary, we're in trouble. I mean, this isn't just a trivial question of FDA's got a little difference of opinion from CMS. This is binary. Either you believe that or you don't believe that, because you can't get to AAP and you can't get a drug approved. So I actually disagree with some of our colleagues that have said in the comments, oh, traditional approval will be okay. I'm not sure that's true. There's no guarantee that if Lilly or Eisai or Roche or later Biogen comes through the traditional process, the CMS is going to cover the label. They haven't articulated any intention equivalent to that, and they broke a whole precedent here with what they've done on accelerated approval. So I just think all our listeners ought to be aware that there's a big group of us that think everything's in play, and it's not, and this lack of standards and this disharmony is incredibly bad. So that answers question 4 of the House's questions. I would say they got to have a hearing, put them all in a room, and have Becerra, the great Secretary of Health and Human Services we currently have, and the 2 heads of the agencies, like a playground discussion and get this sorted out, because this is nuts. In the meantime, we want docs and patients to be able to get coverage to label and just treat people and learn. Now I'm going to take one more minute. I think we have to worry about, and I'd ask my colleagues to comment, I think the puck, we've heard things the last 2 weeks, I think the puck is moving. I think they're going to try and do a registry. And I'm a little miffed that CMS wrote a big draft proposal about a randomized clinical trial structure that could not work. It was never going to get the diversity it wanted. It was going to add 10 years to the process. It would have never stood up under scrutiny. And now we're hearing, well, maybe evidence gathering, maybe we'll do a registry. Look how good Ideas was. Look how good TAVR was. Well, that'll still be 3 to 4 years of standing up a registry. It'll be $50 to $100 million to stand up a registry. You're still not going to get diversity because they're going to default to the same Meshuggah sites, all of which are my friends, but they don't recruit well from the underrepresented populations. And we're not going to get the large number of patients into a registry we need to solve the important scientific questions that people have raised: safety, efficacy, precision medicine, and what's the next generation of therapy supposed to look like. So there's another matzo ball for you, Sue.
All right, well, I've been given the sign that Priya and Kelly, you guys can provide super short responses, and then we're going to wrap it up, but I appreciate you throwing that out, John. Priya, you want to go first?
Sure. I think John has made some excellent points. I think the registry will be as equally problematic as the current CED proposal. And I think we just need to get everybody at the table and figure this out. These drugs are not the only ones out there that are subject to this disconnect. I see it on the device side all the time, and I am very worried we're going to see it for other drugs down the road. So I think this is the test case. Let's get it right and do this for patients.
Kelly?
I agree that this is a trend that isn't going away. Even if CMS does come out with a policy that is less restrictive, something like a registry, these problems will continue, and the threat of a bad coverage decision is just going to keep being a dark cloud over innovation. And I do think that, I don't know if it's going to be Congress or a court that steps in and answers some of these questions about authority and really kind of forces the department's hand and forces them to kind of come together on a more rational way to do coverage. That's also transparent. If they want to talk about cost, if they're worried about cost, they've got to say that, and they've got to have that discussion with Congress.
Okay. Well, thank you everybody so much. Thanks to all our speakers on all the panels today. The comment period ends tomorrow, February 10th. Get your comment in if you haven't done so already. Final decision is going to come out in April. We recorded this. There'll be a YouTube recording on the Alliance for Aging Research YouTube page. Here's our website, and you can find more information. The one last thing I just want to say to everybody, this is really about patients, family caregivers, families. They're human beings. They've paid into the Medicare system their whole lives as well, and they deserve coverage, and we need to do better. Thanks everybody for joining us today. Have a good rest of your day.